Governor Reagan, welcome to Election 80. Leadership is a quality the American people are demanding from a president. Many Americans feel we are not receiving strong, effective leadership today. How would you define leadership?
Well, that's not as easy as it sounds. There have been great leaders throughout the world who have been able to get followers behind them, and they've been evil men who've led them in wrong causes. And we usually think of leadership, however, in those who lead the people in the right direction. I think that one of the main essentials for leadership is communication. We find that if we look back on presidents here in the United States, or men overseas, men like Winston Churchill, we find so often that we remember them in years later, and they're known better in history and more familiar for things they said rather than for the actual deeds they might have performed. So I think it is a case of being able to communicate to a people and persuade those people of the direction they want to go. Now, good leadership, of course, means having a belief in basic principles, moral principles, and things that are worthwhile and for the good of the people you are trying to lead, and then persuading those people of the course they must follow in order to achieve those.
To help further clarify your perspective and view on that, who would you consider the three most effective leaders in history and why?
In all of history? Well, one had to be Moses, and the next had to be Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know whether I could come up with a third to even mention in connection with those two. But if you take the story of Moses and his leadership of the children of Israel, and of course we have seen the story of a 33-year-old man who didn't own anything to speak of, had no extensive education, formal education in the way that we think of it today, simply became an itinerant preacher, probably never traveled in a circle more than 100 miles across, wasn't an ordained minister, didn't have a pulpit, and yet in 3 years established principles that have had more effect for 2,000 years on mankind than all the rulers and all the teachers and all the admirals and scholars who ever lived. Having said those two, I don't know whether I can come up with a third. If we were just talking more modern day leaders and so forth, we would get into the area of men like Churchill, men like our Washington and Lincoln, and yes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, whether we agree now with the things that he did, was able to persuade the people of this country in a time of great distress, the Great Depression, to support him in the programs that he was taking forward, and he was a great war leader.
What I'd like to do now is to take this whole idea of leadership and have you apply it to your role as a leader when you were a governor. What kinds of decisions did you make in the past which indicate your effectiveness as a leader?
Well, I came into the governorship at quite a strange time in California. Our campuses were scenes of rioting in the roaring 60s. We were talking of long, hot summers in our cities because of the racial violence, but economically the state of California was in about the same condition as the federal government is today. It was spending far more than it was taking in each day. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. It had a bureaucracy that had grown 75% over the preceding 8 years. We were the welfare capital of the world, with a welfare load that was increasing at an average of 40,000 people a month, and threatened further bankruptcy or earlier bankruptcy of the state. And as governor, I found the Constitution, of course, prohibited deficit spending, unlike it does at the national level. And one of the first things that I found I had to do was the very thing that I had been campaigning against. Because I came in at the middle of the fiscal year facing already a $200 million deficit, and with the state continuing to spend $1 million to $1.5 million a day more than it was taking in, I had to ask the people of California for a tax increase simply because of that constitutional question that was involved and the what we were up against in the state. I brought in some accountants, some of the most respected accountant firms. They, at no expense to the state, gave a reading on what the state's financial condition was. I took them before the people on television and said to the people here, so they wouldn't think that there was any politics involved, having succeeded a president or a governor of the other party, and then asked for a tax program, but promised the people at the time that I did that I had always thought the taxes were too high, and as soon as possible I would return this money to the people. I set out to halt the growth of the bureaucracy. The term that was used most commonly about me was cut, squeeze, and trim. We did halt that growth. 8 years later, we had virtually the same size government that we had when we started. 8 years later, we had the first AAA rating for California's bonds that we'd had in 31 years. We had saved $2 billion on welfare for the taxpayers, but for the first time in about 8 or 10 years, we had been able to increase the grants to the truly needy. And over that period of time, I kept my word about returning the money to the people. Not much more than a year later, after the tax increase, we started returning surpluses to the people in the form of tax rebates. And at the end of 8 years, had given back to the people in tax rebates and tax credits $5.7 billion. And I had vetoed $16 billion in spending measures that had been introduced in the legislature, which was a Democratic legislature, and I was a Republican governor. And I never had one of those vetoes overridden. And also, I think we gained control of the campuses and restored them to education. There was great violence. There was murder done on our campuses. But we didn't give in to the mob, and the violence disappeared, and the legitimate students who wanted to get an education could do so.
I'd like to, if I may, speculate and move into the future a little bit, because we have our own crises today, and America's constantly being confronted with a crisis situation. Americans are faced with a constant reoccurrence of inflation and recession and rising fuel prices, rising food prices, rising unemployment, and of course we have the ever-present energy crisis. These are the kinds of problems that you would be facing on a daily basis if elected president. What do you intend to do about these issues and these problems? And please be specific.
Well, I believe that most of those things government is responsible for. Government has caused recession, therefore government can make it go away. Government has caused the energy crisis, and therefore government can make it go away. You asked me to be specific. I believe that we have had an interventionist philosophy at work in this country for the last 4 decades or more. Intervening in what should be the free marketplace, but intervening in the lives of the people, exerting controls. I've described it sometimes, and maybe this seems oversimplistic, government exists to protect us from each other. We have had government for the last 40 years that's trying to protect us from ourselves. And we can't have that kind of a caretaker. We can't afford it. That can tell us what is good for us in our daily living and in the control of our destiny and so forth. I would think that one of the first things is you must regain fiscal responsibility in government. That means reducing the size and the extravagance of government, and that means, strangely enough, in my view, a reduction of the percentage of the people's earnings that the government is taking from the individual by way of an across-the-board cut in the tax rates. Now, when I say cut taxes, everyone automatically thinks, well, that means cut government revenues. It doesn't. If history has anything to tell us in this country particularly, if we cut the tax rates, lower the rates to the people, the resultant broadening of the base of the economy and the prosperity that results in everyone, including government, getting more revenue. In other words, we bake a bigger pie. Now, government has reduced the productivity of the American industrial machine and even of the individual. It has reduced it with punitive taxes on the individual that take away incentive. They have taxes on business that make it difficult for them to invest. We have the highest percentage of outmoded industrial plant and equipment in America today of any of the industrial nations. Our rate of per man hour increase in productivity is lower than that of all of our competitors. Now, if we can restore that incentive to both business and individual, and I believe it is done through a reduction in the tax rates, as I say, we will have gone a long way toward ending inflation. If we will bring government back to spending within its means, because government funds much of that deficit spending by turning out printing press money, increasing the quantity of money available, while not comparably having an increase in the goods and services that are available for purchase. Now, some people think that you have to choose between inflation and recession, that the only way you can end inflation is with a recession. I don't believe that at all. And California's Proposition 13 proved that. Everyone said when we made that big slash, when the people in California rebelled against the property taxes, which were making it impossible for people to stay in their own homes. It's been about 15, 16 months now. There are 100,000 fewer public employees in California. But the private sector in these 15 months has increased 532,000 new jobs have been created in this period. Personal earnings are up 14%, retail sales are up 14%, and last year the state ended with a $3 billion surplus. So I truly believe that it is government intervening, government getting in the way. And by the same token, with regard to energy, we had the cheapest, most abundant energy and fuel in the United States that any nation, any part of the world has ever had, all the way from that first oil well that was drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859 up until 1971, when again the government intervened with price controls, restrictions, controls on the marketing, virtually nationalizing the energy industry, particularly in the field of petroleum. And in these 9 years, we have had the increasing prices and we've had the increasing scarcity of fuel. Now, it must be evident that if in 9 years of government interventionism, you've had the shortage and the high price, and almost 120 years of no government intervention, we had plenty. We'd better look at government instead of the energy industry as responsible for our problem today.
Governor Reagan, thank you for being with us on Election 80.
Thank you.